my family, the word difficult was reserved for me. Not for my brother, who crashed 2 cars before he turned 22 and had both written off as bad luck. Not for my mother, who rewrote history so smoothly she could have worked in PR. And certainly not for my father, who nodded along to everything she said, like a man who'd forgotten he had opinions of his own. No, difficult was what they called me. Because I asked questions. Because I didn't cry on cue. Because I became a forensic accountant instead of staying in our small Ohio town and marrying someone my mother approved of. I was 31 when everything finally broke open, and even then the thing that surprised me wasn't the betrayal, it was how long it had been coming. My brother's name is Grant, 4 years older, 6 inches taller, and the kind of person who fills a room by simply deciding to. Growing up, Grant was the story my parents told at dinner parties, the athlete, the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of anything and usually did. I was the footnote. Quietly good at things no one found interesting, math, patterns, details other people missed. When I got into Ohio State on a full academic scholarship, my mother called it impressive. When Grant got into a local community college on his 3rd attempt, she threw him a party. I stopped expecting fairness around age 14. What I didn't stop doing was watching. You learn a lot about a family when you pay attention to the gaps between what they say and what they actually do. I moved to Chicago after grad school. A firm downtown hired me straight out of my master's program, and within 4 years I was running financial fraud audits for mid-sized corporations. The work was exacting and invisible, which suited me fine. I was good at finding things people tried to hide. My family didn't understand what I did. My mother told people I worked with numbers in the vague way you'd describe someone sorting mail. Grant called me the tax lady at every holiday, always with a grin that said he thought it was funny. I stopped correcting them. You can't explain depth to people who only ever swim in the shallow end. I came home twice a year, Thanksgiving and my father's birthday in March. Both times the house was the same, my mother at the center, orchestrating everything. Grant orbiting her like a satellite that never quite broke free. My father in his chair by the window, half present, wearing the soft expression of a man who'd made peace with being peripheral in his own life. Those visits followed a rhythm I could have scripted in my sleep. Grant would arrive late, make everyone laugh immediately, and leave early. My mother would spend the evening finding small ways to remind me that I'd chosen a life she didn't fully endorse. My father would squeeze my hand at some point and say, "Good to have you home, kiddo," and I would believe, just for a second, that he meant it the way I needed him to. The March before everything happened, my father looked tired in a way that was different from before. He'd been slowing down for a couple of years. Retirement had taken something out of him, the kind of structure lost that hollows men who spent 40 years inside it. But this was something else. His hands shook slightly when he poured his coffee. He repeated himself twice during dinner without noticing. I asked my mother about it quietly in the kitchen. She waved her hand. "He's just adjusting, the doctor says he's fine." "Which doctor?" "Emma." Her voice had that edge, the one that meant the conversation was over. I let it go. I always let things go in that house. It was the only way to survive the weekend. My father died 11 months later, a stroke, quiet and fast in his sleep. My mother called me at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. Her voice was composed in the particular way of someone who has already decided how to feel about something. I drove back to Ohio. The funeral was small. My father had been a private man, an engineer, methodical, not given to sentiment. The service reflected him, clean, short, honest. I held it together until they played a hymn he used to hum while doing yard work on Sunday mornings, and then I didn't hold it together anymore. Grant sat next to my mother on the front pew, his arm around her shoulders, looking appropriately bereaved. He didn't look at me once. Afterward, back at the house, my mother moved through the rooms receiving condolences like a woman who had choreographed grief. She was good at this, at presenting the right face for the right moment. I helped with food and stayed out of her way. It was 3 weeks later, when my father's estate went into probate, that I understood something was wrong. I'd known about the will in broad terms. My father had mentioned it years ago. The house would go to my mother, and the rest of the estate, including his investment accounts and his pension distributions, would be split equally between Grant and me. Standard, straightforward, the kind of arrangement a man like my father would have found reasonable. What the probate attorney showed me was not that. The document his office had on file, the one my mother submitted, left everything to Grant. The investment accounts, the savings, the small life insurance policy. Everything except the house, which went to my mother outright. My name appeared once, in a line near the bottom that read, "To my daughter, I leave my library of engineering texts, and my gratitude for her independence." My gratitude for her independence. I sat in that attorney's office and read those words 3 times. I knew my father. I knew how he thought, how he phrased things, what mattered to him. And I knew, with the same bone certainty I felt when I caught a falsified balance sheet, that he had not written that sentence. I didn't say anything in the attorney's office. I asked for a copy of the document, thanked him for his time, and walked to my car. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Then I called the one person I trusted. Her name is Priya, my college roommate, now a civil litigation attorney in Columbus. She answered on the second ring. "I need you to look at something," I said. She heard something in my voice. How bad? I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe my brother forged my father's will. Silence. Then, send me everything you have, tonight. I'd spent a decade learning to find things in documents that weren't supposed to be found. I knew what financial fraud looked like, the subtle misalignments, the metadata anomalies, the places where someone had been careful but not careful enough. A will is a legal document. A legal document is, in its bones, a paper trail. The first thing Priya noticed was the date. The will on file was dated 8 months before my father's death, which was plausible. What wasn't plausible was that it had been notarized by someone whose stamp code didn't match the public records database for licensed Ohio notaries. Priya found it in 40 minutes. She'd seen it before. People used outdated stamps, lapsed licenses, names that looked legitimate if you didn't check. I checked. The second thing I found myself was in the signature. My father's handwriting had a particular quality, an engineer's precision, letters that didn't embellish. The signature on the submitted document had a slight rightward flourish on the capital D of his last name. I pulled every document I could find with my father's authentic signature. Birthday cards, tax returns he'd mailed me copies of when I first started doing my own, a letter he'd written me when I graduated. No flourish, not once, not in 30 years. I sat at my childhood desk with photographs of those signatures spread across the surface and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not grief, something colder and more useful. Recognition. I knew what had happened. Now I had to prove it. Priya filed for a will contest in the probate court. The moment she did, my mother called. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said. Her voice had the temperature of marble. "I'm contesting the will. Your father wanted Grant to have those accounts, he told me himself. Did he tell you in the same conversation where he decided to describe me as independent, instead of leaving me anything he'd worked 40 years to build?" She was quiet for a moment. "You're grieving. I understand that." "I'm not grieving right now," I said. "I'm working." She hung up. Grant called an hour later. His tone was different, less composed, more anxious, which told me he already knew what was in that filing. "This is insane," he said. "You're going to drag the family through court over money. Over Dad's actual wishes." Those were his actual wishes. Mom was there. Mom submitted a document with a fraudulent notary stamp Grant. Silence, long enough to mean something. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had gone flat. "I think you do," I said, "and I think you should talk to a lawyer." He hung up too. I sat in my apartment in Chicago and looked at the city lights and thought about the fact that my brother had just told me, without words, everything I needed to know. Priya was methodical and relentless, which is why I trusted her. She subpoenaed the original notary records. She requested a handwriting analysis from a certified forensic document examiner, a man named Dr. Whitfield out of Cincinnati, who had testified in 17 state cases and had the unshakable credibility of someone who'd never been wrong in a courtroom. She filed for discovery on all communications between my mother, my brother, and any attorneys they might have consulted in the months before my father's death. What came back was more than I expected and exactly what I'd feared. Text messages between my mother and Grant 3 weeks before my father died, discussing the document. Grant asking, "Is it done?" My mother responding, "Tuesday. Don't say anything to her." The her in question wasn't a mystery to anyone. There were emails, too, between Grant and a man named Patterson, who advertised himself online as a notary and estate consultant, and whose license had lapsed 18 months before he'd stamped my father's will. Dr. Whitfield's report was 12 pages. His conclusion took one sentence: the signature on a submitted document is inconsistent with the authenticated samples provided and is, in my professional opinion, not produced by the same individual. Forgery, in black ink on white paper with a certified examiner's signature underneath. My mother hired a local attorney named Bergstrom, who had an office above a dry cleaner on Main Street, and who I suspected had not litigated anything of this complexity in the last decade. He filed a counter-motion arguing that I was motivated by greed and estrangement, and that my father had verbally expressed his wishes to my mother and Grant on multiple occasions. Verbal wishes don't override a notarized will, Priya told the court, and a fraudulent notarized will overrides nothing. Bergstrom tried a second angle: emotional instability. He submitted a letter, signed by 3 of my mother's friends, describing me as distant, cold, and difficult to connect with. Priya didn't even blink. She pointed out, very calmly, to the magistrate, reviewing the discovery documents, that character letters from interested parties had no bearing on forensic handwriting analysis or notary licensing records. The magistrate agreed. I didn't go back to Ohio during this period. I didn't trust myself to be in that house, and more practically, Priya advised against any contact that could be mischaracterized. I worked. I ran audits. I called Priya every Thursday for an update, and otherwise kept my head down. My mother emailed me twice. The first was long paragraphs of justification dressed up as explanation. She wrote about how Grant needed the money more than I did, how I'd always been fine on my own, how my father would have wanted to help his son who was struggling. She wrote near the bottom, "You have your career, Grant has nothing else." I read it once, forwarded it to Priya, and archived it. The second email was shorter. "You're tearing this family apart. I hope you can live with that." I thought about that line for a while. Then I thought about my father, humming in the yard on Sunday mornings, writing me a letter when I graduated, squeezing my hand at the kitchen table, and I thought about someone forging his name on a piece of paper while he was still alive to do it himself. I could live with that just fine. The hearing was on a Thursday in February, a grey Ohio morning that felt appropriate. Priya met me outside the courthouse in a navy coat, coffee in hand, expression composed. She looked like someone who had won before and expected to again. Inside, the wood panels walls of the probate courtroom smelled like old paper and floor wax. My mother was already seated on the opposite side, wearing the pearl earrings she saved for occasions she wanted to look credible. Grant sat beside her in a suit that looked newly purchased, stiff at the shoulders, too dark for the season. He didn't look at me when I walked in. My mother did, briefly, with an expression I recognized, the one she used when she was about to perform composure she didn't feel. Bergstrom opened with the same argument he'd been filing for 3 months. Family unity, verbal wishes. My distance from the family is evidence of my disconnection from my father's true intentions. He was practiced in the way of small-town attorneys who had gotten comfortable. His words came easily, but they didn't land with any particular weight. Priya waited. When Bergstrom sat down, she stood up and placed Dr. Whitfield's report on the bench in front of the magistrate. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. She simply read. The signature analysis, the notary licensing discrepancy, the text messages, the email chain, each piece clean, Time-stamped, verified. She spoke about my father as a man who had spent 40 years being precise. An engineer who designed load-bearing systems doesn't write a flourish into his signature in the last year of his life. A man who once corrected a typo in a birthday card before giving it to me doesn't describe his daughter in a legal document with the phrase, gratitude for her independence, language no one who knew him would recognize as his. The courtroom was very quiet. Bergstrom objected twice. The magistrate sustained neither. At some point, I heard my mother exhale, a sharp, controlled sound that she would have called composure, and I would have called the first crack in a wall she'd been building for 30 years. The magistrate reviewed the report for several minutes. Then he looked up. I have read the forensic analysis submitted by Dr. Whitfield, he said, and reviewed the supplemental documentary evidence, including the communications records obtained in discovery. The inconsistencies in this document are significant and well documented. The notary credential discrepancy alone is sufficient grounds for invalidation. Combined with the handwriting analysis and the communication records suggesting prior coordination, this court finds sufficient basis to invalidate the submitted will. Grant's attorney tried to respond. The magistrate held up one hand. Additionally, he continued, the court is referring this matter to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential criminal conduct, specifically regarding document fraud and the involvement of an unlicensed notary. The silence that followed was total, not the polite silence of a courtroom between arguments. The specific silence of a room full of people who have just heard something that cannot be unsaid. My mother's hand went to her pearls. Grant stared at the table. Bergstrom leaned toward Grant and said something in a low voice. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to help. Priya sat back down beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The magistrate ordered the estate to be reopened and administered according to my father's prior authenticated will, the one he'd filed with his own attorney 8 years ago before any of this, which split everything equally. His attorney had kept it, as attorneys do. It had been there the whole time. Outside, the February air was sharp enough to sting. Priya pulled on her gloves and glanced at me. You okay? Yeah, I said, and I meant it in the plain, factual way. Not fine, not triumphant, just okay. Still standing. She nodded. Prosecutor's office will reach out to you, probably in the next few weeks. You'll need to submit the originals. I know. We stood there for a moment, the courthouse steps empty around us. Inside, through the glass, I could see my mother and Grant still at their table. Bergstrom was packing his briefcase. Nobody was speaking. You knew from the notary, Priya said. It wasn't a question. I knew from the signature, I said. The notary was confirmation. She smiled faintly. You're good at this. I've had practice. She left to get her car, and I stayed on the steps a little longer. The cold was the clarifying kind, the kind that makes everything exact and visible. I wasn't thinking about Grant or my mother. I was thinking about my father, about a man who designed his life around precision and fairness and who deserved, at minimum, to have his actual wishes honored. I thought about him writing me that letter when I graduated. The handwriting even and clean, no flourishes, just fact. I'm proud of you. Keep going. That letter was in a box in my apartment in Chicago. I hadn't needed to scan it or file it as evidence. I just knew what his writing looked like because I'd kept it. Because some things are worth holding on to, not as proof but as memory. My mother called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message later, she sounded smaller than I'd ever heard her. Not defeated, exactly, but compressed. Like a person who'd been counting on something and was now rearranging. She said she didn't understand how it had come to this. She said Grant was devastated. She said she hoped I was satisfied. I deleted the message and didn't call back. Grant texted 2 days later. No greeting, no explanation, just, the prosecutor called me today. I read it twice, then set my phone face down on the desk and went back to work. The prosecutor's review took 4 months. In the end, the county charged Grant with document fraud and conspiracy and referred the notary Patterson, whose license had lapsed, for separate proceedings. My mother was not charged. The prosecutor's office told Priya they lacked sufficient evidence to establish her direct involvement in the forgery itself, as opposed to her knowledge of it. The text messages established awareness. They didn't establish participation. I didn't argue with that. The law is the law, and I'd spend my career learning to let the evidence determine the outcome, not the other way around. Grant took a plea, 18 months probation, restitution, no prison time given, no prior record and cooperation with the investigation. Priya called me when the terms were finalized. Not as much as he deserved, she said. More than he expected. I thought that was probably right. The estate settled 6 weeks later. The split was even, the way my father had intended. After probate fees and attorney costs, my share wasn't life-changing. It wasn't the point. The point was that a forged document now had a correction next to it in the official record, and my father's name wasn't on something he hadn't written. I drove back to Ohio one more time to sign the final paperwork. I didn't go to the house. I signed in the attorney's office, collected a certified copy of the settlement, shook the attorney's hand, and drove straight back to the highway. On the way out of town, I passed the street my parents had lived on for 30 years. I didn't turn down it. The house wasn't mine, and I wasn't going to pretend it held anything I needed. Back in Chicago, I parked in my building's garage and sat in the car for a few minutes before going up. Not from sadness exactly, more from the particular exhaustion of finishing something that had required sustained, quiet effort for a long time. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Clean, minimal, the kind of space that reflects the person who lives in it. On my kitchen counter was a box I'd brought back from Ohio after the funeral. A few things from my father's study that I'd asked my mother if I could take. She'd agreed without much interest. Inside was the stack of engineering texts the will had mentioned, which I kept not for any material reason but because they still had his handwritten margin notes. And underneath those, the birthday cards he'd sent me every year without fail. Every one of them in the same steady, unfussy handwriting. No flourishes, just his. I made coffee and stood by the window and looked at the city doing what cities do, moving, indifferent, full of ordinary life happening in 10,000 directions at once. I didn't feel like a winner. I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a person who had done a difficult thing correctly and was now, finally, on the other side of it. Priya texted that night. It's done. How are you? I typed back, good, thank you, for all of it. She replied with a single line, your dad would have been proud. I put my phone down and finished my coffee. There's a particular kind of peace that comes not from things going right, but from refusing to let things go wrong without a fight. It isn't loud. It doesn't look like victory in the way movies show victory. Nobody cheered. Nobody hugged me in a parking lot. Nobody said you did it. It looked like a Wednesday evening in my apartment, coffee going cold, the city outside unchanged. But the document that had my father's forged signature on it was invalidated, and the one with his real wishes, the one he drafted himself, with his actual attorney, in his own meticulous handwriting, was the one that stood. That was enough. Some corrections don't make noise. They just make things right. And in the end, that's the only kind that lasts. I used to think the hardest part of what happened was finding out my brother had forged my father's signature, but that wasn't it. The hardest part was standing in that attorney's office, holding a copy of a document I knew was wrong, and understanding that the people who were supposed to love me had looked at my entire life and decided I didn't need to be included in it. That's the thing about being quietly competent. People mistake your steadiness for not needing anything. My mother looked at the career I'd built, the apartment in Chicago, the fact that I'd never once called home asking to be rescued, and she read it as proof that I could be passed over. Grant needed the money more. I would be fine. I was always fine. What she didn't understand, what neither of them understood, is that being fine isn't an accident. It's a decision you make every day, usually when things aren't fine at all. I spent years building something out of discipline and attention and the willingness to sit with hard problems until they became solvable. That's not luck. That's work. And the same skills that made me easy to overlook were exactly the ones that unraveled what they'd done. There's a kind of justice in that. Not poetic justice, not the universe correcting itself in some grand way, just the plain, causal kind. My brother thought I was the safe target because I was far away and quiet. He didn't account for the fact that I do this for a living. He handed a forensic accountant a fraudulent document and expected her not to look closely. That's not bad luck. That's consequence. The choice created the outcome, directly and without drama. I think about my father sometimes when I think about what those three things, doing what's right, thinking clearly and not giving up, actually look like in real life. He was an engineer. He didn't talk much about values in the abstract. He demonstrated them through how carefully he did his work, how he signed his name the same way for 30 years, how he sat with me at the kitchen table and never once made me feel like my questions were inconvenient. He had integrity not because he announced it, but because every small decision added up to a life that was consistent. He was honest, he was precise, he kept going. I tried to do the same thing during the months of the case. Not for revenge. I genuinely wasn't angry in the way people expected me to be. I was focused. There's a difference. Anger makes you loud. Focus makes you accurate. I documented everything. I trusted Priya. I let the evidence speak in rooms where my voice wouldn't have carried the same weight. That's what it means to be both principled and clear-headed at the same time. You don't abandon the process just because the people who wronged you are making it personal. The probate court didn't rule in my favor because of how I felt. It ruled because the record was clean and the facts were documented, and the truth, once properly formatted and submitted, is very difficult to argue against. What I took from all of it, what I carry now, a year past the settlement, is this: being overlooked is survivable. Being underestimated is survivable. What's not survivable, long-term, is letting other people's version of who you are become the version you believe. My family decided I was the one who didn't need anything. I decided they were wrong, and I spent the better part of a year proving it quietly in writing, with certified documentation. My father's real will was sitting in his attorney's office the whole time. It had been there for 8 years. He planned fairly the way he did everything. In the end, the truth just needed someone willing to go looking for it. That's always been enough for me.